wiped the sweat from his forehead as he worked the lathe in the small corner of the engineering bay that nobody else wanted. The other human engineers on station preferred the gleaming metal workshops with their plasma cutters and molecular assemblers, had chosen this forgotten space where old-fashioned tools still worked with wood and stone. Still playing with sticks, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Hayes stopped at his workbench, her expression mixing amusement with genuine curiosity. As the station's chief weapons officer, she understood the value of every tool, even if she didn't always understand its methods. Held up the spear he'd been crafting. The shaft was made from ironwood, a tree species from Earth that had somehow adapted to grow in the hydroponics bays. The wood was dense, almost as hard as steel, with a grain that ran straight and true. He'd spent weeks selecting this particular piece, then months seasoning and shaping it. "They are arriving tomorrow for the weapons demonstration," Sarah continued. "Admiral wants our best people showing off our latest plasma rifles and particle beams. Are you sure you want to be part of this?" Tested the balance of his spear. It felt perfect in his hands, the weight distributed exactly where it needed to be. The invitation said to demonstrate human weapons technology. "This is human weapons technology. We've been making spears for 200,000 years. Sarah shook her head but smiled. "You know they're going to laugh at you, right? They have energy shields that can stop a plasma bolt. Their armor can deflect particle beams. They think we humans are primitive enough as it is." "Maybe," said, running his thumb along the smooth wood. "But primitive doesn't mean ineffective." The next morning, station's main docking bay buzzed with activity. The delegation had arrived in a ship that looked more like a work of art than a vessel of war. Smooth curves and flowing lines created a hull that seemed to bend light around itself. When the airlock opened, the aliens emerged with the confident bearing of a species that had conquered half the galaxy. They stood 7 feet tall, with 4 arms and skin that shifted between blue and silver depending on the light. Their leader, commander, wore armor that looked like liquid metal frozen in motion. Energy fields flickered around each piece, creating a defensive barrier that human weapons had never been able to breach. "Greetings, Commander," Admiral stepped forward. "Welcome to station. We're honored to host this cultural exchange." His translator device buzzed. "The honor is ours, Admiral. We are most curious to observe human military capabilities. Our reports suggest your species relies heavily on kinetic projectiles and chemical explosives. Quite nostalgic." The demonstration began in the station's largest cargo bay, which had been cleared for the event. Lieutenant Hayes started with standard human infantry weapons. She fired an assault rifle at an armor sample mounted on a test stand. The bullets bounced off harmlessly, their kinetic energy absorbed by the energy field surrounding the armor. Next came the plasma rifle. The superheated energy bolt struck the armor with a brilliant flash, but the defensive field simply redirected the energy around the protective plates. The armor remained undamaged. "Impressive defensive technology," Admiral admitted. "Our scientists would love to understand how those energy fields work." "Trade secrets, I'm afraid," replied. "Though I must say, your weapons show admirable craftsmanship for such primitive designs. The plasma rifle in particular demonstrates a solid understanding of basic energy manipulation principles." Stepped forward, carrying his wooden spear. A murmur went through the assembled crowd of humans and aliens alike. He wore simple work clothes and safety glasses, looking distinctly out of place among the uniformed officers and their high-tech equipment. "And what is this?" asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Some sort of ceremonial object." "This is a spear," said simply. "I made it myself from ironwood grown in our hydroponics bays. The design is based on weapons my ancestors used to hunt mammoths 20,000 years ago." The delegation erupted in sounds that the translator interpreted as laughter, held up one of his 4 hands for silence. "Forgive us, human. We mean no disrespect to your cultural traditions, but surely you don't intend to test this stick against our military technology." "Actually, I do," hefted the spear, feeling its familiar weight. "With your permission, Commander." Gestured grandly. "By all means, though I should warn you that our armor has deflected weapons far more sophisticated than your wooden implement." Took his position 30 feet from the armor sample. The bay fell silent except for the hum of the life support systems. He had thrown spears since childhood, first at targets in his backyard on Earth, then at increasingly difficult marks as he grew older. But this was different. This was about more than hitting a target. He drew back his arm, feeling the muscles in his shoulder and back coil with potential energy. The spear felt alive in his hand, 200,000 years of human evolution and engineering combined into this single moment. Had studied the footage of armor in action, watched how the energy fields redirected incoming attacks. He had a theory about how those fields worked, and he was about to test it. The spear left his hand with perfect form. It flew straight and true, spinning slowly to maintain its stability. The watched with amused interest, expecting to see another futile demonstration of human inadequacy. The wooden point struck the energy field surrounding the armor. For a split second, nothing seemed to happen. Then something unexpected occurred. The field, designed to deflect high-energy attacks and fast-moving projectiles, seemed to hesitate when faced with the spear's unique characteristics. Ironwood had properties that human scientists were still studying. Its cellular structure created a material that was neither fully organic nor entirely inorganic. When properly seasoned and shaped, it could conduct certain types of energy while remaining completely inert to others. The spear didn't trigger the armor's defensive systems because it didn't register as a threat according to parameters. The wooden point slipped through the energy field like a knife through water. It struck the armor itself with the full force of its throw, concentrated into a point no bigger than a pencil tip. The alien metal, designed to deflect plasma bolts and particle beams, proved surprisingly vulnerable to simple mechanical stress applied in exactly the right way. The spear punched through the armor plating with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent bay. It emerged from the back of the test sample, carrying fragments of alien metal with it, before embedding itself in the cargo bay wall. For a long moment, nobody moved. They stared at the damaged armor as if it had personally betrayed them. The humans looked equally shocked, though for different reasons. They had expected failure and found something else entirely. Commander approached the test stand with slow, deliberate steps. He examined the hole in his people's supposedly impenetrable armor, running one finger around the jagged edges. "This is unexpected," he said finally. Walked over to retrieve his spear, working it free from the wall. The wooden point showed some wear but remained intact. "Ironwood is tougher than it looks," he said, "and sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones." "How?" demanded. "Our energy fields are calibrated to stop any known projectile weapon. Our armor has deflected antimatter warheads. Your defenses are designed for energy weapons and high-velocity projectiles," explained. "This spear moves slower than a bullet, and doesn't give off the electromagnetic signature your sensors expect from a weapon. By the time your systems recognized the threat, it was already past your defenses." Admiral found his voice. "Do you realize what you've just done? You've penetrated technology that our best scientists couldn't touch." "I threw a pointy stick at alien armor," replied with a slight smile. "My ancestors would understand the concept perfectly." Continued studying the damaged armor. "The implications are significant. If a simple wooden spear can defeat our defensive systems, we may need to reconsider our understanding of human military capabilities." "It's not just about the spear," said. "It's about thinking differently. Your armor is incredibly advanced, but it makes assumptions about what constitutes a weapon. Sometimes the most sophisticated defense can be overcome by something simple and unexpected." Lieutenant Hayes stepped closer to examine the damage. "The penetration is clean," she noted. "No thermal scoring or energy discharge marks, it's purely mechanical damage." "Exactly," nodded. "The energy field couldn't redirect kinetic force it didn't recognize as a threat. The armor itself is tough, but it's designed to spread impact across a large area. A spear concentrates all its force into a single point." Commander was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications. His people had built their military superiority on the assumption that more advanced technology would always defeat less advanced technology. The demonstration had just shattered that assumption in the most basic way possible. "Your species continues to surprise us humans," he said finally. "We came here expecting to see crude weapons and primitive tactics. Instead, we discover that primitiveness itself can be a form of sophistication." "That's one way to look at it," agreed. "Another way is that evolution doesn't waste energy on solutions that don't work. Humans have been making spears for most of our existence as a species. We've had a lot of time to get good at it." The demonstration continued with other human weapons, but the mood had shifted completely. The watched everything with new attention, no longer dismissive of human military technology. They began asking detailed questions about manufacturing techniques, materials science, and tactical applications. Found himself at the center of attention, explaining the principles behind his success to aliens who commanded fleets capable of glassing planets. He talked about wood grain and balance points, about the physics of spinning projectiles, and the psychology of throwing weapons. The concepts were simple, but their application required understanding that couldn't be programmed into a computer or replicated by manufacturing systems. The spear is more than just a weapon, he explained to a group of fascinated officers. It's a tool that extends human capability. When you throw a spear, you're not just launching a projectile. You're applying 200,000 years of human experience in hunting, warfare, and problem-solving. As the formal demonstration ended, Commander approached privately. "Engineer, I have a proposition for you. Our military commanders would be very interested in learning more about human weapons philosophy. Would you consider visiting our as a technical consultant?" "Consider the offer. What exactly would you want me to teach?" "How to think like a human," replied. "Our species has become dependent on technological superiority. We've forgotten that the mind behind the weapon is often more important than the weapon itself. Today's demonstration reminded us of that lesson." "I'd be honored," said, "but I have one condition." "Name it." "I bring my workshop tools. If I'm going to teach how to think like humans, they're going to learn how to make things with their hands. Real things, not just energy patterns and molecular assemblies." Skin shifted to a deeper blue, indicating amusement. "Agreed, though I suspect our engineers will find the experience challenging." That evening, sat in his workshop, putting the finishing touches on another spear. Word of the demonstration had spread throughout station, and he'd already received requests from 3 different departments wanting to study ironwood's properties. The xenobiology team wanted to understand how Earth trees had adapted to station life. The materials science division wanted to analyze the wood's unique electromagnetic characteristics. The tactical assessment group wanted to know if the same principles could be applied to other weapons. Lieutenant Hayes found him there, working by the light of an old-fashioned lamp. "So," she said, settling into a chair made from the same ironwood as his spears, "how does it feel to revolutionize interstellar warfare with a stick?" Smiled, testing the balance of his new spear. "I didn't revolutionize anything. I just reminded everyone that humans became the dominant species on Earth for good reasons. We're adaptable, we're creative, and we don't give up when the obvious solution doesn't work." "They are already talking about updating their defensive systems," Sarah noted. "Apparently, word of your demonstration has reached their high command. They want to field test their armor against various primitive weapons." "They're missing the point," replied. "It's not about primitive versus advanced. It's about understanding your tools and your target. The spear worked because I understood both the wood and the armor better than the armor's designers understood their own creation." He held up the completed spear, examining it in the lamplight. The wood gleamed with a depth that no artificial material could match. Each growth ring told a story of the tree's life, its struggles and adaptations recorded in the density and grain of the wood. "You know what the real lesson is?" continued. "Humans don't just use tools, we become part of them. When I throw a spear, I'm not operating a machine. I'm extending my own body and mind through a piece of shaped wood. That connection, that integration between human and tool, that's what makes us dangerous." Sarah nodded slowly. "The aliens have better technology, but we have better intuition." "Exactly. They can build armor that stops plasma bolts, but they can't anticipate every possible attack because they've lost touch with the fundamental principles of warfare. They've automated their thinking along with their weapons." Outside the workshop, Station continued its slow rotation, carrying its mixed crew of humans and friendly alien species through the void between stars. But in this small corner, surrounded by wood shavings and hand tools, worked with technologies older than civilization itself. Tomorrow he would begin preparing for his journey to where he would teach the galaxy's most advanced military force how to think with their hands as well as their computers. It would be the greatest cultural exchange in human history, built around a wooden spear that had taken him 3 months to make and 3 seconds to throw. He smiled, thinking about his ancestors who had hunted mammoths with the of Nexus Prime rose before the transport ship like a jewel suspended in space. 3 moons orbited the planet, each one hosting massive orbital platforms that bristled with defensive systems. Energy barriers shimmered between them, creating a protective net that could stop any conventional attack. Pressed his face to the viewport, watching the alien world grow larger as they approached. Impressive, isn't it? Commander stood beside him, two of his four arms clasped behind his back. Nexus Prime has never fallen to enemy attack. Our ancestors built those defenses over 1,000 years ago, and we've been improving them ever since. Nodding how the orbital platforms moved in perfect coordination, their positions constantly shifting to eliminate blind spots. It's beautiful, but I'm noticing something interesting about the design. Oh, skin shifted to a curious shade of purple. What observations do you have? All your defenses are designed to stop attacks coming from space, said. Energy barriers, plasma cannons, particle interceptors. Everything assumes your enemies will approach from outside the system with advanced weapons. Of course, replied. What other form could an attack take? We control all the jump points into this system. No enemy fleet could approach without being detected light years away. Smiled but said nothing. He'd learned that sometimes the best way to teach was to let people discover things for themselves. Instead, he turned his attention to the crate of supplies he'd brought from station. Along with his workshop tools and several spears, he'd packed seeds from earth plants, basic chemistry equipment, and a collection of human historical texts about warfare and engineering. The transport docked at Nexus Prime's main spaceport, a gleaming complex that could have housed a small city. Thousands of beings moved through its corridors, representing dozens of species from across space. Most gave curious looks, recognizing him as the human who had achieved the impossible. Word of your demonstration has spread quickly, explained as they walked through customs. Our military academy has requested a full presentation. Several of our top generals want to meet with you personally. Their destination was the War College, a massive complex built into the side of a mountain overlooking the capital city. The architecture was typical of design, all flowing curves and organic shapes that seemed to grow from the landscape itself. But notice something else, details that most visitors would miss. How old are these buildings? He asked as they rode a transport tube up the mountainside. The original structures date back 800 years, replied. Though they've been extensively modernized, why do you ask? The foundation stones, pointed to the base of the nearest building. They're not work. The cutting technique is different, more angular. Someone else built the first version of this place. Was quiet for a moment. You're very observant engineer. Yes, this complex was originally built by a species we replaced in this region. They were excellent stonemasons but lacked our advanced technology. What happened to them? They became part of our civilization, said carefully. Those who adapted to our ways were integrated into society. The others found new homes elsewhere. Filed that information away for later consideration. The transport delivered them to the main entrance of the War College, where a group of officers waited to greet them. Their armor was even more elaborate than with additional energy fields and what looked like built-in weapon systems. Engineer, the lead officer stepped forward. I am General or Commandant of the War College. Welcome to Nexus Prime. We are eager to learn from your unique perspective on military technology. The general's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced that a human with a wooden spear had anything valuable to teach the galaxy's most advanced military force. Had encountered that attitude before, both from aliens and from his own species. It usually made his demonstrations more effective. Thank you, General, replied. I'm looking forward to working with your people. Where would you like to start? We've prepared a comprehensive testing facility, or gestured toward the college's main building. Our best armor, our most advanced defensive systems, everything you could need to demonstrate your techniques. They walked through corridors lined with displays showing the history of military conquest. Holographic battles played out in glass cases, showing sleek alien ships defeating enemies with overwhelming technological superiority. Studied each display, noting patterns in how they approached warfare. You've never lost a war, he observed. Not in recorded history, or confirmed with pride. Military doctrine is based on technological advantage combined with superior tactics. We study our enemies carefully, then develop weapons systems specifically designed to counter their capabilities. What about enemies you haven't studied? species you've never encountered before. Our technology is adaptable, the general replied. Our armor's energy fields can adjust to new threats automatically. Our weapons can be reconfigured on demand. We plan for unknown variables. Nodded but didn't comment. They reached the testing facility, a vast underground chamber that looked like it could withstand a direct hit from a starship's main guns. Rows of different armor types hung from mechanical arms, each one representing the latest in defensive technology. Energy barriers flickered between them, creating overlapping fields of protection. Impressive setup, said, setting down his equipment case. But I'd like to start with something simpler. Do you have a basic workshop, hand tools, raw materials, that sort of thing? Or looked confused. We have molecular assemblers, plasma forges, matter compilers. Anything you need can be manufactured to precise specifications within minutes. I'm sure it can, replied. But I need tools I can use with my hands. Hammers, chisels, lathes, things that require skill rather than programming. Why would you want such primitive equipment? One of the other officers asked. Our manufacturing systems are far more precise and efficient. Pulled one of his spears from the case, holding it where the artificial lights could illuminate the grain of the ironwood. Because precision and efficiency aren't the only things that matter. This spear took me 3 months to make, from selecting the wood to putting on the final finish. Every step required decisions that only I could make. The end result isn't just a weapon. It's an extension of my experience and judgment. He handed the spear to Orr, who examined it with obvious skepticism. It's well crafted for a primitive weapon, the general admitted. But surely you don't expect us to abandon our advanced manufacturing techniques for medieval woodworking. I don't expect you to abandon anything, said. I want you to understand the difference between making something and having something made for you. When you create a tool with your own hands, you understand it in ways that no computer analysis can match. They exchanged glances that suggested they thought the human had lost his mind, but had briefed them on what happened at station, so they agreed to humor his request. Within an hour, they'd located and transported a basic workshop from one of the city's museums. Spent the rest of the day setting up his workspace in a corner of the testing facility. The officers watched with fascination as he arranged hand tools that their ancestors might have recognized. Hammers and chisels, files and sandpaper, measuring devices that required human judgment rather than digital precision. Now, said when everything was ready, I want each of you to make something. Anything you want, using only these tools and your own hands. Make what? Orr asked. For what purpose? Make something that matters to you personally, replied. Something you'll be proud to show your family. The purpose is to understand the connection between creator and creation. The generals looked at each other uncertainly. They were used to commanding vast fleets and managing complex logistics, not working with primitive hand tools, but was patient, showing them how to hold the tools properly, how to read the grain of wood, how to shape metal through controlled application of force. General Orr decided to make a decorative blade, something that might have been carried by his ancestors before energy weapons were invented. He struggled at first, trying to apply the same systematic approach he used for military planning. The metal didn't respond the way he expected, bending and twisting under his inexperienced hands. It's not working, he said in frustration after his third attempt resulted in a bent piece of scrap. The material is defective. The material is fine, replied, but you're fighting it instead of working with it. Metal has its own properties, its own preferences. You need to understand what it wants to do, then guide it toward what you want to create. Metal doesn't want anything, Orr protested. It's inanimate matter. Picked up a piece of steel bar stock, heating it in the small forge he'd set up. Watch the color changes as it heats. See how it begins to glow? That's the metal telling you it's ready to be shaped. Feel how it responds to light hammer blows versus heavy ones. It's communicating with you, but you have to pay attention to understand what it's saying. Gradually, the officers began to understand what meant. Working with hand tools required a different kind of attention than they were used to. Instead of programming a machine and letting it do the work, they had to engage directly with the materials, learning their properties through touch and observation. Over the following days, something unexpected happened. The generals who had initially dismissed human primitive technology became absorbed in their projects. Orr's blade gradually took shape under his increasingly skilled hands. Other officers worked on different items, decorative armor pieces, ceremonial weapons, even simple tools for their personal use. "I'm beginning to understand," Or said on the fourth day, examining his nearly completed blade. "When I use our manufacturing systems, I design something and the machine builds it exactly to specifications. But when I make something myself, I discover things about the design that I never could have planned." "Exactly," nodded. "You're not just making a blade, you're having a conversation with the materials, learning what works and what doesn't through direct experience. That knowledge becomes part of you in a way that technical manuals never could." Commander had been observing the workshop sessions with growing interest. "This is why your spear was so effective," he said. "You didn't just throw a wooden stick at our armor, you threw 200,000 years of human experience in making and using spears." "Right," agreed. "Every spear I make builds on everything I've learned from previous spears. Every throw teaches me something new about balance and accuracy. The weapon and the warrior evolve together." But had more to teach than just craftsmanship. On the fifth day, he led the officers to an outdoor training area where he'd set up targets at various distances. Each general had completed at least one handmade weapon during their time in the workshop, and now wanted to show them how traditional training methods differed from their high-tech approach. "Your military doctrine emphasizes overwhelming technological advantage," he began, watching the examine the targets. "You study your enemies, then build weapons specifically designed to counter their capabilities. It's an effective approach, but it has weaknesses." "What weaknesses?" Or demanded. "Our forces have never been defeated in open combat." "You've never faced an enemy who could adapt faster than your technology," replied. "Your weapons are precisely calibrated for specific threats, but what happens when you encounter something completely unexpected?" He demonstrated by setting up a series of increasingly difficult challenges. First, he threw his spear at a standard target from 30 paces, hitting it dead center. Then he moved the target, changed its angle, and added obstacles between himself and the goal. Each time, he adjusted his technique to compensate for the new conditions. "An energy rifle would have the same accuracy regardless of conditions," one of the officers pointed out. "Why struggle with manual adjustments when technology can compensate automatically?" "Because technology can only compensate for variables it's been programmed to handle," replied. "Watch this." He set up a final target that seemed impossible to hit with a thrown spear. The target was positioned behind a barrier that blocked direct line of sight, with only a small opening near the top that would allow a projectile to reach it. The angle required was so steep that conventional wisdom suggested no human could make the throw. Studied the challenge for several minutes, walking around the setup from different angles. He picked up several small stones, throwing them experimentally to test wind conditions and sight lines. Finally, he selected his longest spear and took a position that seemed completely wrong to the watching. "He's too far away," one of them whispered, "and the angle is impossible." Drew back his arm and threw with a motion that looked more like a javelin toss than a spear throw. The weapon arced high into the air, following a trajectory that seemed to carry it well off target. Then, at the peak of its flight, it began to descend toward the narrow opening. The spear slipped through the gap and struck the hidden target with a solid thunk that echoed across the training ground. The officers stared in silence, trying to understand how a human had calculated such a complex trajectory using only instinct and experience. "No computer could have made that throw," Or said slowly. "The variables are too complex, too dependent on real-time conditions." "That's the point," retrieved his spear from the target. "Human adaptability isn't just about using tools differently. It's about seeing possibilities that don't exist in any manual or database. When you make your own weapons and train with them constantly, you develop an intuitive understanding that goes beyond technical knowledge." Approach the target setup, studying the angles and obstacles. "This explains why your species has been so successful despite your technological limitations. You don't just use tools, you become them. And we don't just learn techniques, we learn how to learn," added. "Every challenge teaches us something that helps with the next challenge. That's why humans can adapt to almost any situation given enough time." The workshop sessions continued for another week, with more officers requesting time to work with hand tools and traditional materials. Word spread throughout the War College, then to other military installations across Nexus Prime. What had started as a curiosity about primitive human weapons was becoming something much larger. Found himself teaching not just craftsmanship and tactics, but a completely different way of thinking about problems. They had become so dependent on their technology that they'd lost touch with the fundamental principles underlying their own success. They could build incredible weapons and armor, but they'd forgotten why those designs worked. "We've been treating symptoms instead of understanding causes," General or admitted during one of their evening discussions. "Our armor stops plasma bolts because we programmed it to stop plasma bolts, but we never asked ourselves what makes a plasma bolt dangerous in the first place." "Energy, heat, and directed force," replied. "Once you understand those principles, you can defend against any weapon that uses them, even weapons that haven't been invented yet. And more importantly, you can find ways around defenses that are only calibrated for specific threats." The transformation wasn't limited to military thinking. Engineers began visiting the workshop, curious about human manufacturing techniques. Scientists wanted to understand how hand tools could achieve precision that their measurements said should be impossible. Even artists and craftspeople came to learn about the relationship between maker and creation. Realized that he wasn't just teaching aliens about human weapons technology. He was helping an entire civilization rediscover skills and perspectives they'd lost in their rush toward technological advancement. The wooden spear that had started everything was becoming a symbol of something much larger, the idea that progress didn't always mean abandoning the past. But as word of his success spread, began to notice something troubling. Not all were happy about humans teaching their military new ways to think. Some viewed it as a threat to their technological superiority, while others worried about the implications for their carefully ordered society. High Admiral watched the morning briefing with barely concealed irritation. 3 weeks had passed since the human had arrived on Nexus Prime, and reports from the War College painted a disturbing picture. Officers were abandoning proven military doctrine to experiment with primitive weapons and obsolete tactics. Worse still, preliminary tests suggested these ancient methods were somehow effective against modern defenses. "Explain to me again how a wooden stick penetrated our most advanced armor," the Admiral demanded, his 4 arms crossed in a gesture that clearly conveyed displeasure. His blue-silver skin had darkened to an angry purple, a color change that made his subordinates noticeably nervous. Colonel N, the War College's head of weapons research, consulted his data tablet with shaking hands. "The human's projectile bypassed our energy field systems by operating below their activation thresholds. Our defenses are calibrated to respond to high-energy threats and fast-moving projectiles. The wooden spear didn't register as dangerous until it had already penetrated the field perimeter. So our armor failed because it was too sophisticated to recognize a primitive threat," said, his voice carrying the kind of cold anger that had ended careers throughout space. "How is that possible?" "Our defensive systems operate on threat assessment algorithms developed over centuries of warfare," another officer explained. "They automatically identify and counter known weapon types, plasma bolts, particle beams, kinetic projectiles above certain velocity thresholds. But the human spear fell outside all established parameters." Turned to face the massive holographic display that dominated the briefing room. It showed real-time sensor data from across the Nexus Prime system, with particular attention to the orbital defense platforms that protected there. "Have you tested our planetary defenses against similar primitive attacks?" "That's complicated, sir," Colonel N admitted. "The human has requested permission to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of our defensive systems. He claims he can identify additional vulnerabilities using his primitive weapons approach." "Absolutely not," snapped. "Bad enough that our officers are playing with sticks and stones. I will not allow this human to expose weaknesses in our primary defenses." But even as he spoke, the Admiral knew he might not have a choice. Word of success had reached the high command, and there were rumors that other species in their empire were beginning to question military dominance. If the humans had discovered fundamental flaws in their defensive systems, those flaws needed to be identified and corrected before their enemies learned to exploit them. Meanwhile, in the War College's converted workshop, was putting the finishing touches on his most ambitious project yet. Working with a team of officers who had become enthusiastic converts to his methods, he'd been developing new weapons based on traditional human designs, but adapted for alien physiology. General or hefted the weapon had designed for him, a throwing stick that took advantage of the four arms and enhanced strength. The device looked simple enough, just a curved piece of hardwood with careful attention to balance and aerodynamics. But in Or's capable hands, it could accurately strike targets at ranges that impressed even the skeptics. "The key is understanding how your body wants to move," explained, watching as another officer practiced with a sling designed for proportions. "Your people have been using energy weapons for so long that you've forgotten you have natural mechanical advantages. Four arms give you throwing capabilities no human could match if you learn to coordinate them properly." Commander approached carrying his own weapon, a spear thrower that amplified his already considerable strength. "The engineering principles are fascinating," he said. "These aren't just primitive tools. They're precisely calculated instruments that turn biological capability into mechanical advantage." "Exactly," nodded. "Technology should enhance natural ability, not replace it. When you understand your own physical capabilities, you can design tools that work with your body instead of requiring your body to adapt to the tool." The workshop had become a gathering place from across the military hierarchy. Young officers came to learn new skills, while veterans discovered that their decades of experience could be applied in unexpected ways. The wooden weapons taught them to make weren't intended to replace energy rifles and plasma cannons, but rather to supplement them with capabilities that high-tech weapons couldn't provide. "Silent operation," General Orr explained to a group of visiting intelligence officers. "Electromagnetic invisibility, no power source to detect or disrupt, and most importantly, no technological signature that enemy systems can identify and counter." Smiled, remembering similar conversations he'd had with human special forces units. "Plus, they're immune to electromagnetic pulse. They don't require ammunition in the traditional sense, and they can be manufactured from local materials in any environment. A soldier with the right knowledge can make an effective weapon from resources that exist almost anywhere." The intelligence officers exchanged meaningful glances. The implications for covert operations were obvious. Commandos equipped with traditional weapons could infiltrate enemy facilities without triggering any of the technological sensors designed to detect modern military equipment. But not everyone was pleased with these developments. As worked with his expanding group of students, he'd become aware of increasing resistance from parts of the establishment. Conversations would stop when he entered rooms, and he'd notice security personnel watching him more closely than before. The tension came to a head when High Admiral made an unannounced visit to the War College. Was in the middle of demonstrating advanced spear techniques when the Admiral arrived with a full security detail, his dark purple skin color broadcasting his mood to everyone present. "So this is the human who claims our defenses are inadequate," announced, his voice carrying clearly across the workshop. "I've come to see these miraculous primitive weapons for myself." Set down his spear and faced the Admiral calmly. He'd dealt with skeptical authority figures before, both alien and human. "Admiral, I presume, welcome to our workshop. Would you like to try making something yourself?" The offer clearly wasn't what it expected. "I didn't come here to play with sticks, human. I came to evaluate a potential security threat." "What kind of threat?" asked, genuinely curious. "Reports suggest you've discovered fundamental flaws in military technology," the Admiral replied. "If true, such information could be extremely valuable to our enemies. I need to assess whether you represent a security risk." Nodded thoughtfully. "I can understand your concern, but I think you're misunderstanding what I've been teaching. I haven't discovered flaws in your technology. I've demonstrated that over-reliance on any single approach creates vulnerabilities." "Explain," gestured toward the various weapons displayed around the workshop. "Your armor is incredibly effective against the threats it was designed to stop. Your energy weapons can devastate any target they can hit. Your defensive systems can protect against almost any conceivable attack. But all of these advantages depend on your enemies fighting the kind of war you're prepared for." "And what other kind of war exists?" demanded. Instead of answering directly, picked up one of the training spears. "May I demonstrate something? I promise not to damage anything valuable." The Admiral gestured curtly for him to proceed. Walked to the center of the workshop, where a holographic projector displayed a three-dimensional representation of a typical warship. The projection showed the vessel's energy shields, armor placement, and weapons systems in perfect detail. "This is a beautiful ship," said, studying the hologram. "Heavily armed, well-protected, designed by experts who understood exactly what threats they needed to counter. But look at this area here." He pointed to a section near the ship's main engines. "Your designers assumed that any attack would come from enemy warships using similar technology to your own. So they concentrated the heaviest armor where your own weapons would be most effective. But what if an enemy approached from an unexpected direction using weapons your sensors couldn't detect?" Threw his spear at the holographic ship, aiming for a point where the projected armor was thinnest. Of course, the spear passed harmlessly through the light projection, but his intent was clear. "A wooden spear wouldn't damage a starship," he continued. "But a small team of infiltrators with primitive weapons could potentially disable critical systems without triggering any defensive responses. Your security is designed to stop technological attacks, not human ingenuity." Admiral stared at the hologram, his skin color shifting through several different shades as he processed the implications. "You're suggesting that our technological superiority has made us vulnerable to low-technology attacks." "Not vulnerable exactly," corrected, "but less adaptable than you could be. Your military doctrine is incredibly effective, but it's based on specific assumptions about how wars are fought. When those assumptions don't hold true, you need other options." The Admiral was quiet for several minutes, studying the workshop and its occupants. Officers who had been working on traditional weapons projects watched nervously, unsure whether their Admiral would approve or condemn their activities. Finally spoke, "You claim these primitive methods can supplement our existing capabilities. Prove it." "What kind of proof would satisfy you?" asked. "I want a full-scale demonstration," the Admiral declared. "You against our best defenses, using whatever weapons and tactics you choose. If you can identify genuine vulnerabilities in our systems, we need to know about them. If you can't, then this entire experiment ends immediately." Felt a chill run down his spine. The challenge was fair, but he suspected the Admiral was hoping he would fail spectacularly, providing justification for ending the human weapons program and possibly expelling from Nexus Prime entirely. "What would I be attacking?" he asked. "Our planetary defense grid," replied, causing gasps from several officers present. "The orbital platforms that protect Nexus Prime represent our most advanced military technology. If you can find weaknesses there, the knowledge would be invaluable. If you can't, you've proven that primitive weapons are irrelevant against modern defenses." General or stepped forward. "Admiral, with respect, the orbital platforms are critical infrastructure. If something goes wrong during the demonstration—" "Nothing will go wrong," cut him off. "The platforms can defend against antimatter warheads and planet-killer weapons. A few humans with wooden spears hardly represent a significant threat." Considered the challenge carefully. The orbital defense platforms were indeed formidable, designed to stop entire fleets of enemy warships. But he'd been studying their specifications for weeks, and his conversations with officers had revealed some interesting details about how the systems operated. "I accept," he said finally, "but I have some conditions." "Name them." "First, I want to use a mixed team of humans and all equipped with traditional weapons. This isn't about human superiority over technology. It's about demonstrating alternative approaches to military problems." "Acceptable," the Admiral nodded. "Second, I want complete access to technical specifications for the platform's defensive systems. If I'm going to find vulnerabilities, I need to understand exactly how they work." "Also acceptable. What else?" Smiled, "I want 3 months to prepare. Traditional weapons require different kinds of training than your officers are used to. If we're going to do this properly, we need time to develop the right techniques." Admiral's skin shifted to a deeper purple. 3 months? Surely primitive weapons don't require such extensive preparation. "They do if you want to use them effectively," replied. "Remember, I spent my entire life learning to throw spears before I came to your officers have had 3 weeks. That's enough time to learn basic techniques, but not enough to master them." The Admiral considered this. 3 months would give him time to analyze methods and prepare countermeasures if necessary. And if the human failed after such extensive preparation, it would definitively prove that traditional weapons were useless against modern defenses. "Very well," he agreed. 3 months. But understand this, human. If you fail to demonstrate any significant vulnerabilities in our defense grid, you and your primitive weapons program will be removed from Nexus Prime permanently. Nodded, understood, and if I succeed? His expression was unreadable. If you succeed, we'll need to have very serious discussions about the future of military doctrine. After the Admiral left, the workshop buzzed with nervous energy. Some of the officers were excited about the upcoming demonstration, while others worried about the consequences of challenging their most important defensive systems. "Are you certain about this?" Commander asked privately. "The orbital platforms have never been successfully attacked. Even our own military exercises have never managed to penetrate their defenses." "I'm not certain about anything," admitted. "But I've been studying the technical specifications, and I have some ideas. The platforms are designed to stop large-scale attacks from enemy fleets. They might not be as effective against small-scale infiltration using unconventional methods." "What kind of unconventional methods?" Picked up one of the spears he'd been crafting, testing its balance and flexibility. "The kind that don't trigger automatic defensive responses because they don't fit the threat profiles your systems expect. Remember, the same principles that worked against your armor might apply to larger defensive installations." Over the following weeks, threw himself into preparation with an intensity that impressed even the hard-working. He studied every technical manual he could access, analyzed recordings of the platform's defensive systems in action, and consulted with engineers who had built and maintained the installations. More importantly, he began training a select group of volunteers in advanced techniques that went far beyond basic spear throwing. These were soldiers and officers who had shown natural aptitude for traditional weapons, and pushed them to develop skills that most humans would have considered impossible. "Forget everything you know about energy weapons," he told them during one training session. "Those weapons are designed to be used by anyone after minimal training. Traditional weapons are different. They become more effective as the user's skill increases, but there's no upper limit to how skilled you can become. They learned to throw spears with precision that their own understanding of ballistics. They mastered techniques for moving silently in vacuum suits, for calculating complex trajectories without computer assistance, for improvising weapons from common materials found on space platforms. But most important innovation was teaching them to think like infiltrators rather than warriors. Traditional military doctrine emphasized overwhelming force and technological superiority, taught them to use stealth, misdirection, and unexpected approaches that could bypass defenses entirely. "The best attack is one that your enemy doesn't recognize as an attack until it's too late," he explained. "Orbital platforms are designed to detect and destroy incoming threats, but what if the threat is already inside the defensive perimeter when it activates?" As the 3-month deadline approached, felt a mixture of confidence and apprehension. His team had developed capabilities that would have seemed impossible at the beginning of their training, but they were still preparing to challenge the most sophisticated defensive system in space, using weapons that hadn't changed fundamentally in 20,000 years. The stakes couldn't be higher. Success would revolutionize how they thought about warfare and defense. Failure would end his mission and possibly damage human relations permanently. But as watched his team practicing their techniques with the focused intensity of true masters, he felt the same quiet confidence he'd experienced when throwing his first spear at alien armor by the day of the demonstration dawned clear across Nexus Prime's capital region. From the observation deck of the War College, could see all 3 orbital platforms that comprised the planet's primary defense grid. They hung in space like artificial stars, their hulls gleaming with the distinctive blue-silver energy fields that made technology recognizable throughout the galaxy. Admiral had assembled an audience that included representatives from across the military hierarchy. Generals, admirals, technical specialists, and intelligence officers filled the observation deck, their collective attention focused on the human who claimed he could penetrate their most sophisticated defenses with wooden spears and ancient tactics. "The platforms are operating at full defensive readiness," Colonel reported, consulting a bank of monitoring stations. "All energy shields active, all weapon systems online, all sensors calibrated to detect incoming threats. The defensive grid has never been more secure." Nodded, watching as his carefully trained team made final preparations. 12 volunteers had been selected for the mission. 6 humans from station who had joined the project, and 6 who had mastered the traditional weapons techniques he'd taught them. Each carried equipment that would have been familiar to prehistoric warriors, adapted for use in the vacuum of space. "Explain your plan one more time," Admiral demanded. His skin had shifted to a deep blue-purple color that indicated both skepticism and barely controlled anger. The past 3 months had been difficult for him, as reports filtered in from across space about military units experimenting with primitive weapons and unorthodox tactics. "It's really quite simple," replied, checking his own equipment one final time. "Your orbital platforms are designed to detect and destroy large threats approaching from outside the defensive perimeter. They're incredibly effective against fleets of warships or planet-killer missiles, but they make certain assumptions about what constitutes a threat." He held up a traditional spacesuit that had been modified with equipment his team had crafted by hand. "These suits have no active electronic systems beyond basic life support. No propulsion, no weapons signatures, no electromagnetic emissions that would register on your sensors. To your defensive grid, they're just space debris." "Impossible," General Orr protested. He had become one of strongest supporters, but even he had limits. "Our sensors can detect objects the size of a pebble at 10,000 kilometers. A person in a spacesuit would be clearly visible." "Visible, yes," agreed, "but not threatening. Watch." On the main display screen, 12 small objects separated from a maintenance shuttle that had been conducting routine operations near the innermost platform. The objects appeared to be standard cargo containers, the kind used daily for supply runs between the planetary surface and orbital installations. The platform's defensive systems scanned the containers automatically, confirming they contained no weapons, no explosives, no energy sources that could pose a threat. The objects were allowed to drift on their current trajectory, which would carry them harmlessly past the platform's outer hull. "I don't understand," Admiral said, studying the display. "Those are just supply containers." "Are they?" asked quietly. On the screen, the containers began to break apart as they approached the platform. But instead of revealing their expected contents, each container released a human or figure in a specially modified spacesuit. His team had been hiding inside the containers, using techniques adapted from ancient siege warfare to infiltrate the supposedly impregnable defenses. Alarms began sounding as the platform's sensors detected the unauthorized personnel, but by then it was too late. The infiltrators were already inside the defensive perimeter, too close to the platform for the automated weapons to engage without risking damage to the installation itself. "They're using the platform's own safety protocols against it," Colonel N realized with growing amazement. "The defensive systems won't fire on targets within the minimum safe distance." His team moved with practiced precision, using magnetic grapples and guided momentum to navigate the platform's exterior hull. Their movements were silent and efficient, following routes that had plotted during his weeks of studying the installation's technical specifications. "What are they doing?" Admiral demanded. "Even if they reach the platform, they can't penetrate the hull with primitive weapons." "They don't need to penetrate the hull," replied. "They just need to disable the right systems." On the screen, the infiltrators converged on what appeared to be a random section of the platform's outer surface. To most observers, it looked like any other part of the hull, but had identified it as the location where several critical sensor arrays were mounted, systems that fed information to the platform's central computer. The team went to work with tools that looked impossibly primitive against the backdrop of advanced alien technology. But the tools had been crafted specifically for this mission, designed to exploit weaknesses that the platform's builders had never considered. "Sensor Array 7 is showing anomalous readings," one of the monitoring technicians reported. "Signal strength is degrading across multiple frequencies." His team was using techniques adapted from traditional sabotage methods, attacking the connections between sensor components rather than the heavily armored sensors themselves. Wooden wedges driven between hull plates created mechanical stress that disrupted sensitive electronic systems. Specially prepared plant fibers introduced into cooling vents caused gradual overheating of critical components. "This is impossible," Admiral stared at the displays in disbelief. "They're disabling military-grade systems with sticks and plant material." "They're using the same principles that made my spear effective," explained. Your defenses are calibrated for high-energy attacks and obvious threats. They're not designed to handle sustained, low-level interference that falls below the threshold for automated responses. One by one, the platform's sensor systems began failing as team worked their way through a carefully planned sequence of sabotage operations. Each individual action was minor, but the cumulative effect was devastating to the installation's ability to monitor and respond to threats. Platform defensive capability is degraded by 60% and falling, Colonel reported, his voice filled with amazement and horror. At current rates, the installation will be effectively blind within 30 minutes. But had more to demonstrate. As his team completed their sabotage operations, they regrouped at a predetermined point on the platform's hull and began unpacking equipment that had been hidden in their modified spacesuits. "What are they doing now?" General Orr asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Phase 2, replied simply. His team assembled what appeared to be a massive crossbow, constructed from materials they had crafted themselves using traditional techniques. The weapon was sized for strength and designed to function in the vacuum of space, but its operating principles were unchanged from devices that human armies had used 2,000 years earlier. "They can't possibly penetrate the platform's armor with that," Admiral protested. "Our hull plating can withstand direct hits from plasma cannons." "They're not targeting the hull plating," pointed out. The crossbow fired, launching a spear that had been crafted from the same ironwood had used in his original demonstration. But this spear was larger and had been fitted with a specially designed head that had spent weeks perfecting. The projectile struck what appeared to be a solid section of the platform's hull, but had identified it as the location of a critical power coupling that fed energy to the installation's primary defensive systems. The spear punched through the relatively thin covering that protected the coupling, then expanded inside the conduit in a way that severed the connection without triggering any of the automated repair systems. "Primary power grid is experiencing cascading failures," a technician reported with growing panic. "Defensive systems are going offline across the entire platform." Within minutes, the most sophisticated defensive installation in space had been reduced to a hulking piece of metal drifting helplessly in orbit. Its weapons were offline, its sensors were blind, and its energy shields had collapsed completely. The observation deck fell silent except for the soft hum of life support systems. Every present was staring at the displays, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Their supposedly impregnable defenses had been neutralized by a dozen individuals using weapons that predated by. "How?" Admiral asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "By understanding the difference between strength and resilience," replied. "Your platform is incredibly strong. It can withstand massive attacks from conventional weapons, but strength isn't the same thing as resilience. A resilient system can adapt to unexpected challenges. A strong system that lacks resilience becomes fragile when faced with threats it wasn't designed to handle." He gestured toward the displays showing the disabled platform. "Your engineers built that installation to stop fleets of warships armed with the most advanced weapons available. They never considered that someone might attack it with stealth, patience, and tools that don't register as threats until it's too late." Commander, who had been one of the infiltration team members, appeared on the communications screen from the platform's interior. "We've completed our objectives," he reported. "The installation is secure, and all systems have been disabled according to plan." "Any casualties?" asked. "None," confirmed. "The platform's crew is unharmed but confined to quarters. They never saw us coming." Admiral turned away from the displays, his expression unreadable. "Bring them back," he ordered quietly. "All of them, and begin immediate repairs to the platform." The extraction operation proceeded as smoothly as the infiltration had. His team evacuated the platform using the same stealth techniques they'd employed to reach it, leaving behind only subtle evidence of their presence. Within 2 hours, they were back aboard the shuttle that had launched them, returning to Nexus Prime with proof that the galaxy's most sophisticated defenses could be overcome by simple human ingenuity. But the real impact of the demonstration was only beginning to be felt. As word spread throughout the military hierarchy, commanders across their empire began their own defensive preparations. If the orbital platforms protecting there could be defeated by primitive weapons and ancient tactics, what did that say about the security of other installations? The implications are staggering, General or admitted during the post-mission briefing. We'll need to completely reconsider our defensive doctrines, install new sensor systems, revise threat assessment protocols, train personnel to recognize unconventional attacks. That's one approach, agreed, but you might also consider a different strategy. What do you mean? Admiral asked. His skin color had stabilized to a more normal blue-silver shade, but his expression remained troubled. Instead of just defending against primitive attacks, you could incorporate primitive methods into your own operations, suggested. Train your forces to use traditional weapons and tactics as supplements to their high-tech equipment. Give them capabilities that enemy sensors can't detect and defensive systems can't counter. The idea sparked intense discussion among the assembled officers. Some saw the potential immediately, recognizing that the same techniques that had defeated their defenses could be turned against their enemies. Others worried about the implications of abandoning their technological advantages. You're talking about fundamentally changing how we conduct warfare, Colonel pointed out. Military doctrine has been based on technological superiority for over 1,000 years. I'm not talking about abandoning your technology, clarified. I'm suggesting you add new capabilities that complement your existing strengths. A soldier who can use both a plasma rifle and a wooden spear is more versatile than one who only knows how to use high-tech weapons. Admiral was quiet for a long time, considering the ramifications. Finally, he spoke. Your demonstration has proven that our current defensive posture is inadequate. That information alone is worth the resources we've invested in this project. But you're suggesting something much more ambitious. What would you need to implement such a program? General asked. Smiled, thinking about the workshop that had started everything. Teachers, he said simply. People who understand both traditional methods and modern applications. Humans who can work with your officers to develop hybrid techniques that take advantage of physiology and technology. How many teachers? The Admiral asked. As many as you can get, replied. This isn't something that can be learned from manuals or computer simulations. It requires hands-on instruction and years of practice, but the results speak for themselves. The meeting continued for hours as the leadership grappled with the implications of what they'd witnessed. By the end, they had reached a consensus that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The Empire would begin incorporating human primitive weapons techniques into their military training programs. But as left the briefing room, he couldn't shake the feeling that his success had created new complications. Demonstrating human capabilities to friendly aliens was one thing, but word of these techniques would inevitably spread to less friendly species, potentially creating threats that neither humans nor had anticipated. The wooden spear that had started everything had become the catalyst for changes that would reshape warfare throughout the galaxy. Whether those changes would benefit humanity in the long term remained to be seen. For now, was content to return to his workshop and continue teaching the ancient arts that their ancestors had forgotten. Each student who learned to make and use traditional weapons became a bridge between two very different approaches to solving problems. And somewhere in the back of his mind was already thinking about his next project, a crossbow designed specifically for zero-gravity combat, based on designs his ancestors had used to hunt woolly. Months after the orbital platform demonstration, stood in the largest workshop he'd ever seen. The Ministry of Defense had converted an entire wing of their research facility into what they called the Traditional Weapons Integration Center. Hundreds of beings worked at benches throughout the cavernous space, their hands busy with wood, metal, and stone, while their minds grappled with concepts that bridged of technological development. The workshop buzzed with activity that would have seemed impossible to imagine when first arrived on Nexus Prime. Engineers worked alongside human instructors, learning to forge metal with hammer and anvil while discussing the quantum mechanics behind energy shields. Military officers practiced ancient archery techniques while analyzing how those same principles could be applied to modern plasma weapons. "Status report," Admiral requested as he joined at a central observation platform. The Admiral's attitude had changed dramatically since the demonstration. Where once he'd viewed human primitive weapons as a curiosity at best and a threat at worst, he now recognized them as a crucial component of military evolution. "Better than I hoped," replied, watching a group of commandos practicing infiltration techniques that combine traditional stealth methods with modern technology. Your people are natural learners. They're not just copying human techniques, they're improving on them. This was true in ways that continued to surprise. Physiology offered advantages that humans couldn't match. Forearms allowed for throwing techniques that no human could replicate. Their enhanced strength meant they could use weapons scaled beyond anything in human history. Most importantly, their systematic approach to learning meant they were developing training programs that could spread these skills throughout their military forces far more efficiently than human methods. The integration is proceeding faster than our most optimistic projections, Commander reported, approaching from a section where his team was working on what they called hybrid weapons. These were devices that combined traditional materials and construction techniques with technology, creating tools that offered the best of both approaches. Examined one of the hybrid spears team had developed. The shaft was made from ironwood grown in specially designed hydroponics facilities, but the head incorporated metallurgy that created an edge sharper and stronger than any material available to ancient humans. The weapon could function as a traditional thrown spear, but it also contained microcircuits that allowed it to interface with modern targeting systems. "This is impressive work," said, testing the spear's balance. "But remember, the technology should enhance the weapon's natural capabilities, not replace them. If a soldier becomes dependent on the electronic components, they lose the adaptability that makes traditional weapons effective." "Understood," nodded. "We're designing everything with manual override capabilities. The electronic systems provide additional information and options, but the weapon remains fully functional without them." Across the workshop, other teams were developing innovations that pushed the boundaries of what traditional weapons could accomplish. Materials scientists had created new alloys that combined the electromagnetic properties of ironwood with metallic strength and durability. Engineers had designed manufacturing systems that could produce traditional weapons with the precision of modern fabrication, while preserving the subtle variations that made hand-forged items superior. But the most significant developments were happening in the tactical training sections, where military doctrine was being fundamentally reimagined. Officers who had spent their careers planning battles around energy weapons and technological superiority were learning to think like primitive warriors, developing strategies that emphasized adaptability, stealth, and psychological impact over raw firepower. "Show him the simulation," Admiral instructed, leading to a holographic display area where advanced computer systems recreated historical battles in three-dimensional detail. The display showed a space engagement between forces and an unknown enemy fleet. But unlike traditional simulations that focused on ship-to-ship combat, this scenario emphasized boarding actions and close quarters, fighting where traditional weapons could prove decisive. "Watch this," the Admiral said as the simulation began. "The enemy fleet has technology comparable to our own: energy shields, plasma weapons, particle beam defenses. In a conventional engagement, the battle would be decided by which side had better equipment and training with that equipment." The holographic fleets engaged in typical space combat, exchanging devastating energy blasts across thousands of kilometers. Ships on both sides took damage, but their defensive systems proved roughly equivalent. The battle settled into a stalemate that could have continued for hours. Then the fleet implemented tactics that recognized from his own teachings. Small groups of Marines launched in stealth pods that registered as debris to enemy sensors. Instead of attempting to breach the enemy ship's hulls with conventional weapons, they used techniques adapted from ancient siege warfare to disable external systems and create entry points. "The boarding parties are equipped with hybrid weapons based on your designs," Admiral explained as the simulation showed Marines fighting through enemy corridors with a combination of traditional spears and modern energy shields. "They're proving remarkably effective against opponents who expected conventional ship-to-ship combat." Watched the simulation with mixed feelings. The adaptation of his teachings was brilliant, but it also represented a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought throughout the galaxy. The techniques he'd developed to promote understanding between species were being weaponized in ways he hadn't anticipated. "This is based on a real scenario," the Admiral continued. "Intelligence reports suggest that several hostile species are developing countermeasures to our conventional tactics. We needed new approaches that our enemies couldn't predict or prepare for." And you think traditional weapons provide that advantage? Asked. I know they do, replied. Our first field test was conducted last month against hegemony raiders who had been terrorizing shipping lanes in the outer systems. They had studied our standard tactics and developed effective countermeasures. But they had no defense against boarding parties using primitive weapons and ancient siege techniques. The Admiral activated another display showing footage from an actual battle. Watched forces disable enemy ships using tactics that would have been familiar to warriors from Earth's medieval period, adapted for space combat and enhanced with modern technology. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical success, Admiral noted. The enemy crews surrendered rather than face opponents they couldn't understand or predict. Word is spreading throughout hostile space that they have developed new and terrifying capabilities. Felt a chill as he realized the full implications of what he had started. You've turned traditional weapons into psychological warfare tools. Among other applications, the Admiral agreed, but that's not the most important development. He led to a secured section of the workshop where a smaller group of specialists worked on projects that were clearly classified at the highest levels. The security here was than anything had seen, with multiple checkpoints and armed guards who watched every movement. What you're about to see cannot leave this facility, Admiral warned. This information is restricted to our most senior military leadership. Nodded, though he wondered what could be more sensitive than the revolutionary tactical developments he'd already witnessed. The secured area contained workbenches where artisans crafted weapons that looked like nothing had ever seen. They appeared to be traditional in construction, made from wood and metal using hand tools, but their proportions and design elements were completely alien. We've been studying historical records of the species that originally inhabited this region, Admiral explained. They were skilled craftsmen who developed traditional weapons technologies that we never fully understood. With your teachings as a foundation, our researchers have been reconstructing techniques. Examined one of the reconstructed weapons, a device that looked like a cross between a spear and a tuning fork. The metalwork was exquisite, displaying a level of craftsmanship that suggested the had been master smiths. But more importantly, the weapon incorporated design principles that were completely different from human traditions. They understood something about materials and energy that we're only beginning to comprehend, the Admiral continued. Their weapons could apparently disrupt electronic systems through purely mechanical resonance. No energy source, no electromagnetic emissions, just properly tuned metal vibrating at specific frequencies. Have you been able to replicate the effect? Asked, running his fingers along the weapon's strange curves. To some extent. In the frozen wilderness of prehistoric Earth. On station, sometimes the oldest solutions really were still the best ones. The real test would come when he had to demonstrate his teachings against the most advanced defenses Nexus Prime could offer, and suspected that some were hopping he would fail. Weapons across the frozen steppes of prehistoric Earth, they would have understood perfectly. Sometimes the oldest solutions were still the best ones.